Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to do some compare and contrast, because that's what passes for hip in world history circles. Right, so you've probably heard of Christopher Columbus, who in 1492 sailed the ocean blue and discovered America, a place that had been previously discovered only by millions of people.
Mr. Green, Columbus was just a lucky idiot.
Yeah, no. Here's a little rule of thumb, me from the past. If you're not an expert in something, don't pretend to be an expert. This is going to serve you well both in your academic career and in your kissing career. Moving on! So unlike me from the past, I'd argue that Columbus has a deserved reputation in history, but was he really the greatest sailor of the 15th century? Well, let's meet the other contestants. In the red corner, we have Zheng He, who, when it comes to ocean-going voyages, was the first major figure of the 15th century. And in the blue corner is Vasco da Gama from scrappy little Portugal, who managed to introduce Europeans to the Indian Ocean trade network. Columbus, you have to sit in the polka-dotted corner. As you'll no doubt remember from our discussion of Indian Ocean trade, it was dominated by Muslim merchants, involved ports into Africa and the Middle East and India and Indonesia and China, and it made a lot of people super rich. That last point explains why our three contestants were so eager to set sail. Well, that and the ceaseless desire of human beings to discover things and contract scurvy. Let's begin with Zheng He, who is probably the greatest admiral you've never heard of. Couple important things about Zheng He. First, he was a Muslim. That may seem strange until you consider that by the late 14th century, China had long experience with Muslims, especially when they were ruled by, wait for it, the Mongols. Secondly, Zheng He was a eunuch. Fortunately, 15th century China had excellent general anesthesia, so I'm sure it didn't hurt at all when they castrated him. What's that, Stan? They didn't have general anesthesia? Oh boy. No. Stan, I'm seeing it. I can see, Stan, show me something cute right now. Oh, hi there, kitty. How'd you get in that little teacup? Thank you, Stan. Right, so Zheng He rose from humble beginnings to lose both of his testicles and become the greatest admiral in Chinese history. Let's go to the thought bubble. Between 1405 and 1433, Zheng He led 7 voyages throughout the Indian Ocean, the expeditions of these so-called treasure ships, and they were huge. Columbus's first voyage consisted of 3 ships. Zheng He led an armada of over 300 with a crew of over 27,000, more than half of London's population at the time. And some of these ships were, well, enormous. The flagships, known as the treasure ships, were over 400 feet long and had 7 or more masts. You see that tiny little ship there in front of the treasure ship? That's a to-scale rendering of Christopher Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria. Zheng He wasn't an explorer. The Indian Ocean trade routes were already known to him and to other Chinese sailors. He visited Africa, India, and the Middle East, and in a way, his journeys were trade missions, but not in the sense of filling his ships up with stuff to be sold later for higher prices. At the time, China was the leading manufacturer of quality goods in the world, and there wasn't anything they actually needed to import. What they needed was prestige and respect, so that people would continue to see China as the center of the economic universe. So there was a tribute system through which foreign rulers or their ambassadors would come to China and engage in a debasing ritual called the kowtow, wherein they acknowledged the superiority of the Chinese emperor and offered him, or her, but usually him, gifts in exchange for the right to trade with China. The opportunity to humble yourself before the Chinese emperor was so valuable that many a prince was happy to jump on a treasure ship and sail back to China with Zheng He. Also, these tribute missions brought lots of crazy things to China, including exotic animals. From Africa, Zheng He brought back a zoo's worth of rhinos, zebras, and even giraffes. Basically, he was like the medieval Chinese Noah. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So the Chinese were world leaders in naval technology, and they wanted to dominate trade here in the Indian Ocean, so why then did these voyages end? One reason was that Zheng He couldn't live forever, and sure enough, he didn't. Also, his patron, the Yongle Emperor, died. And the emperor's successors weren't as interested in maritime trade. They were more concerned with protecting China against its traditional enemies, nomads from the steppe. To do this, they built a rather famous wall. The Great Wall was mostly built under the Ming Dynasty using resources that they only had because they stopped building gigantic ships. And just imagine what might have happened if the Ming emperors had embraced a different strategy, one that was based on outreach instead of isolationism. And now to the blue corner representing Portuguese exploration, we have Vasco da Gama. A couple things about Portugal. First, it has a fair bit of coastline. Secondly, it was relatively resource poor, which meant it relied upon trade in order to grow. Also, the Iberian Peninsula was the only place in Europe where Muslims could be found in large numbers in the 15th century, which meant the Christian crusading spirit was quite strong there, presumably because Muslims had brought so much stability and prosperity to the region. And chief among these would-be crusaders was Prince Henry the Navigator, so called because he was not a navigator. He was, however, a patron not only of sailors themselves, but of a special school at Sagres in which nautical knowledge was collected and new maps were made and all kinds of awesome stuff happened. And all that knowledge gave Portuguese sailors a huge competitive advantage when it came to exploration. Henry commissioned sailors to search for two things. First, a path to the Indian Ocean so they could get in on the lucrative spice trade. And second, to find the kingdom of Prester John, a mythical Christian king who was supposed to live in Africa somewhere so that Henry could have Prester John's help in a crusade. Da Gama was the first of Henry's proteges to make it around Africa and into the Indian Ocean. In 1498, he landed at Calicut, a major trading post on India's west coast, and when he got there, merchants asked him what he was looking for. He answered with 3 words: gold and Christians, which basically sums up Portugal's motivations for exploration. So once the Portuguese breached the Indian Ocean, they didn't create like huge colonies because there were already powerful empires in the region. Instead, they apparently sat in the middle of the Indian Ocean doing nothing. Actually, they were able to capture and control a number of coastal cities, creating what historians call a trading post empire. They could do this thanks to their well-armed ships, which captured cities by firing cannons into city walls like IRL Angry Birds. But since the Portuguese didn't have enough people or boats to run the Indian Ocean trade, they had to rely on extortion. So Portuguese merchant ships would capture other ships and force them to purchase a permit to trade called a cartaz. And without a cartaz, a merchant couldn't trade in any of the towns that Portugal controlled. To merchants who'd plied the Indian Ocean trade for years in relative freedom, the Portuguese were just glorified pirates, extracting value from trade without adding to its efficiency or volume. So the cartaz strategy sort of worked for a while, but the Portuguese never really took control of Indian Ocean trade. But they were successful enough that their neighbors, Spain, became interested in their own route to the Indies. And that brings us to Columbus. But first, let's dispel some myths. 1, Columbus and his crew knew the Earth was round. He was just wrong about the Earth's size. Columbus used Ptolemy's geography and the Imago Mundi based on Muslim scholarship and ended up overestimating the size of Asia and underestimating the size of the oceans. 2, Columbus never thought he'd made it to China. He called the people he encountered Indians because he thought he'd made it to the East Indies, what we now know as Indonesia. And 3, Columbus was not a lucky idiot. He navigated completely unknown waters primarily by using a technique known as dead reckoning, in which you figure out your position based on 3 pieces of information: the direction you're going, your speed, and the time, which you figure out via hourglass. With only that technology to guide you, it's not actually that easy to hit a continent. Come here, people who are saying he didn't hit a continent, he only hit some islands. Come here. Oh, it's time for the open letter? An open letter to the line of demarcation. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, it's a globe. Thanks, Stan. Just what I always needed. Dear line of demarcation, you have so much to teach us about the way that the world used to work and the way that it works now. In 1494, Pope Alexander VI settled a dispute between Portugal and Spain by dividing the world into 2 parts: the Spanish part and the Portuguese part. This whole thing, at least according to Pope Alexander VI, could be split between Spain and Portugal, at least when it came to so-called unclaimed land. I mean, unclaimed by whom? You know, all the American Indians were like, wait, this land is available? In that case, we'll just keep it. It's all the same to you. Anyway, line of demarcation, I have great news for you. What Alexander VI did totally worked. We haven't had a problem since. Best wishes, John Green. So Columbus's first journey, he made 4, the last 3 of which were pretty calamitous, was tiny, and he initially landed on a small Caribbean island he called San Salvador in search, like the Portuguese, of gold and Christians. He was able to convince Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain to fund his expedition by promising riches and conversions of the natives, hopefully to sign them up for yet another crusade. And there's a long-standing myth that Columbus tricked Ferdinand and Isabella into paying for his trip, but in fact, they commissioned 2 different sets of experts to analyze his plans, both of which agreed he was crazy. One called the plan impossible to any educated person. But even so, Ferdinand and Isabella footed the bill, partly because they were full of crusading zeal after expelling the Muslims from Spain, and partly because they were desperate to get their hands on some of that pepper richness. Columbus, of course, failed at finding riches. He returned with neither spices nor gold. He did create some Christians, as we'll discuss in a future episode, but in terms of goal accomplishment, Columbus was much less successful than either Zheng He or Vasco da Gama. But within 2 generations of Columbus, Spain would become fantastically wealthy, and for a time they were the leading power in Europe. Columbus's voyages also had a huge, largely negative impact on the people the Spanish encountered in the Americas. And excitingly from my perspective, once Columbus returned from San Salvador, we can speak for the first time of a truly world history. Except for you, Australia. So who was the greatest mariner of the 15th century? Well, as usual, it depends on your definition of greatness. If you value administrative competence over ill-advised adventure, then Zheng He is certainly the winner. But the reason we remember Columbus over him or Vasco da Gama is that Columbus's voyages had a lasting impact on the world, even if it wasn't necessarily a positive one. And that makes me wonder what kind of person you'd want to be. A capable administrator and brilliant sailor like Zheng He, a daring captain like da Gama, or the bearer of a complicated but famous legacy like Columbus? Let me know in comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher Raoul Meyer and myself, and our graphics team is Thought Bubble. Last week's phrase of the week was "You smell pretty." Thanks for that suggestion, by the way. If you want to suggest future phrases of the week, you can do so in comments, where you can also guess at this week's phrase of the week or ask questions about today's video that will be answered by our team of historians. Thanks for watching Crash Course, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome. Oh, crash! No, avoided. Going to involve other parts of the world, and also, not to brag, a small part of the moon. Sorry, we can be a little bit self-aggrandizing sometimes here in America. So to begin U.S. history, we're not going to talk about the United States or this guy. We're going to talk about the people who lived here before any Europeans showed up. North America was home to a great variety of people, so it's difficult to generalize, but here's what we can say. One, when the Europeans arrived, there were no classical-style civilizations with monumental architecture and empires like the Aztec or the Incas. And two, native North Americans had no metalwork, no gunpowder, no wheels, no written languages, and no domesticated animals. However, they did have farming, complex social and political structures, and widespread trade networks.
Mr. Green, Mr. Green!
So they were pretty backwards, huh? Well, I mean, or at least primitive.
Primitive is a funny word me from the past because it implies a romanticization, these simple people who never used more than they needed and had no use for guns, and it also implies an infantilization. It's like you believe that just because you have a beeper and they didn't, they were somehow less evolved humans. But you can't see the human story as one that goes from primitive to civilized. That's not just Eurocentric, that's contemporary-centric. The idea that we're moving forward as a species implies a linear progression that just does not reflect the reality of life on this planet. I get that you like to imagine yourself as the result of millennia of advancement and the very pinnacle of humanness, but from where I'm sitting, that worldview is a lot more backwards than living without the wheel. So no one knows exactly how many people lived in North America before the Europeans got here. Some estimates are as high as 75 million, but in the present US borders, the guesses are between 2 and 10 million. And like other Native Americans, their populations were decimated by diseases such as smallpox and influenza. Actually, it was much worse than decimation. As many of you have pointed out, decimation means 1 in 10. This was much worse than that. It was closer maybe to 8 in 10, which would be an octocimation. So there had been civilizations in North America, but they peaked before the Europeans arrived. The Zuni and Hopi civilization round about here peaked about 1200 CE. They had large multiple family dwellings in canyons, which they probably left because of drought. Crash Course world history fans will remember that environmental degradation often causes the decline of civilizations. I'm looking at you, Indus Valley, and also you, entire future Earth. But complex civilizations weren't the rule in North America, and now we're about to begin generalizing. A bad habit historians have, partly because there's a limited historical record, but also because Eurocentric historians have a bad habit of primitivizing and simplifying others. So I want to underscore that there was huge diversity in the pre-Columbus American experience, and that talking about someone who lived here in 1000 BCE and talking about someone who lived here 2,000 years later is just inherently problematic. That said, let's go to the thought bubble. Most native groups in most places organized as tribes, and their lives were dominated by the natural resources available where they lived. So West Coast Indians primarily lived by fishing, gathering, and hunting sea mammals. Great Plains Indians were often buffalo hunters. These tribal bands often united into loose confederacies or leagues, the best known of which was probably the Iroquois Confederacy, also called the Great League of Peace. This was kind of like an upstate New York version of NATO, but without nuclear weapons or the incessant international meddling or Latvians. Okay, it was nothing like NATO, actually. Religion usually involved a vibrant spiritual world with ceremonies geared toward the tribe's lifestyle. Hunting tribes focused on animals, agricultural tribes on good harvests, and most Indian groups believed in a single creator god who stood above all the other deities, but they weren't monotheistic in the way that Christians who came to the New World were. American Indians also saw property very differently from Europeans. To First Peoples, land was a common resource that village leaders could assign families to use, but not to own, and most land was seen as common to everyone. As Black Hawk, a leader of the Sauk tribe, said, "The Great Spirit gave it to his children to live upon and cultivate as far as necessary for their subsistence, and so long as they occupy and cultivate it, they have a right to the soil." Thanks, Thought Bubble. So many of us tend to romanticize American Indians as being immune from greed and class, but in fact there were class distinctions in Indian tribes. Rulers tended to come from the same families, for instance. That said, wealth was much more evenly distributed than it was in Europe. And while most tribal leaders were men, many tribes were matrilineal, meaning that children became members of their mother's family. Also, women were often important religious leaders. Women also often owned dwellings and tools, although not land, because again, that idea did not exist. Also, in many tribes, women engaging in premarital scoodly pooping wasn't taboo. In general, they were just much less obsessed with female chastity than Europeans were. I mean, I will remind you, the first English settlement in America was called Virginia. The idea that Native Americans were noble savages, somehow purer than Europeans and untouched by their vices, is not a new one. Like, some of the earliest Europeans saw the Indians as paragons of physical beauty and innocent of Europeans' worst characteristics. But for most Europeans, there was little noble about what they saw as pure Indian savagery. I mean, Indians didn't have writing, they suffered from the terrible character flaw of being able to have sex without feeling ashamed, and most importantly, they weren't Christians. The Spanish were the first Europeans to explore this part of the world. Juan Ponce de Leon arrived in what is now Florida in 1513 looking for gold in the fabled Fountain of Youth. In 1521, he encountered a Calusa brave's poison-tipped arrow and died before discovering that the Fountain of Youth is, of course, delicious Diet Dr. Pepper. Oh. I can taste all 23 flavors. There were many more Spanish explorers in the first half of the 16th century, including one Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, who wandered through the American Southwest looking for gold, which I mention entirely because I think that guy's last name means cowhead. Of course, none of these people found any gold, but they did make later European colonization easier by bringing over the microbes that wiped out most native populations. So the Spanish wanted to colonize Florida to set up military bases to thwart the pirates who preyed on silver-laden Spanish galleons coming out of Mexico. But Spanish missionaries also came over hoping to convert local native populations. This, of course, worked out magnificently, just kidding, it went terribly, and many of the missions were destroyed by an uprising of Gual Indians in 1597, and I will remind you, mispronouncing things is my thing. In general, colonizing Florida sucked because it was hot and mosquito-y. Spain was much more successful at colonizing the American Southwest. In 1610, Spain established its first permanent settlement in the Southwest at Santa Fe, New Mexico, and you couldn't really say that it flourished since Santa Fe's population never got much above 3,000, but it had a great small-town feel. And New Mexico is really important because it's the site of the first large-scale uprising by Native Americans against Europeans. I mean, the native people, who the Spanish called pueblos, had seen their fortunes decline significantly since the arrival of Europeans. How much decline? Well, between 1600 and 1680, their population went from about 60,000 to about 17,000. Also, the Franciscan friars who came to convert the indigenous people became increasingly militant about stamping out all native religion. The Spanish Inquisition just wasn't very keen on the kind of cultural blending that made early conversion efforts successful. So while the Spanish saw all the pueblos as one people, they also knew there were tribal differences that made it difficult for the Indians to unite and rise up against the Spanish. But nothing unites like a common enemy, and in 1680, a religious leader named Popé organized an uprising to drive the Spaniards out. Popé organized about 2,000 warriors who killed 400 Spanish colonists and forced the rest to leave Santa Fe. So the Spanish colony in New Mexico was effectively destroyed. The pueblos tore down all the Christian churches and replaced them with kivas, their places of worship. But like most awesome uprisings, it didn't last. But after the revolt, the Spanish were much more tolerant of indigenous religion, and they also abandoned the forced labor practice called encomienda. Oh, it's time for the new Crash Course feature, the mystery document? How mysterious. The rules here are simple. I read and attempt to identify the mystery document. If I am right, I do not get shocked by this shock pen, and if I am wrong, I do. Okay, what do we have here? The Indians were totally deprived of their freedom and were put in the harshest, fiercest, most horrible servitude and captivity, which no one who has not seen it can understand. Even beasts enjoy more freedom when they are allowed to graze in the fields, but our Spaniards gave no such opportunity to Indians and truly considered them perpetual slaves. I sometimes came upon dead bodies on my way, and upon others who were grasping and moaning in their death agony, repeating, "Hungry, hungry." And this was the freedom, the good treatment, and the Christianity the Indians received. Well, that's nice. Okay, so the mystery document is always a primary source, and since the writer refers to our Spaniards, I'm going to guess that he or she, probably he, is European, and a Spaniard sympathetic to the Indians, which narrows the list of suspects considerably. So it probably wasn't De Sepulveda, for instance, who argued that the Indians might not even be human. Okay, Stan, I'm actually pretty confident here. I believe it is from a short account of the destruction of the Indies by Bartolomé de las Casas.
Oh, dang it!
Oh, Stan just told me I have the author right, but the book wrong. It's a history of the Indies. Oh, I hate shocks, both literal and metaphorical. So we focused a lot on the brutality of the Spanish toward the Indians, but at least one Spaniard, de las Casas, recognized that his countrymen were terrible. This realization is a good thing, obviously, but it leads us to one of the big problems when it comes to studying this time and place. The Black Legend is the tale that the Spanish unleashed unspeakable cruelty on the Indians. Now, that tale is true, but that idea was used by later settlers, especially the English, to justify their own settlements. Like, part of the reason they needed to expand their empire was to save the Indians from the awful Spanish, but were the English so much better? Yeah, probably not. As we mentioned at the beginning of today's episode, American Indians didn't have writing, so we don't have records of their perspective. Now, some Europeans, like de las Casas, were critical of the Spaniards, but most considered the Indians heathens and implied, or even outright said, that they deserved whatever horrible things befell them. So at the beginning of our series, I want to point out something that we need to remember throughout. One of the great things about American history is that we have a lot of written sources. This is the advantage of the US coming onto the scene so late in the game, historically speaking. But every story we hear comes from a certain point of view, and we always need to remember who is speaking, why they are speaking, and especially which voices go unheard and why. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and myself, and our graphics team is Thought Bubble. If you have questions about today's video, you should ask them in comments. Everybody who works on Crash Course, as well as a team of historians, will be there to answer them. Thanks for watching. Please make sure you're subscribed to Crash Course, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to tell the story of how a group of plucky English people struck a blow for religious freedom and founded the greatest, freest, and fattest nation the world has ever seen. These Brits entered a barren land containing no people and quickly invented the automobile, baseball, and Star Trek, and we all lived happily ever after.
Mr. Green, if it's really that simple, I am so getting an A in this class.
Oh, me from the past. You're just a delight. So most Americans grow up hearing that the United States was founded by pasty English people who came here to escape religious persecution. And that's true of the small proportion of people who settled in the Massachusetts Bay and created what we now know as New England. But these Pilgrims and Puritans, there's a difference, weren't the first people or even the first Europeans to come to the only part of the globe we didn't paint over. In fact, they weren't even the first English people. The first English people came to Virginia. Off topic, but how weird is it that the first permanent English colony in the Americas was named not for Queen Elizabeth's epicness, but for her supposed chastity? Right, anyway, those first English settlers weren't looking for religious freedom, they wanted to get rich. So the first successful English colony in America was founded at Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. I say successful because there were two previous attempts to colonize the region. They were both epic failures, the more famous of which was the colony at Roanoke Island set up by Sir Walter Raleigh, which is famous because all the colonists disappeared, leaving only the word Croatan carved into a tree. Jamestown was a project of the Virginia Company, which existed to make money for its investors, something it never
never did.
The hope was that they would find gold in the Chesapeake region like the Spanish had in South America, so there were a disproportionate number of goldsmiths and jewelers there to fancy up that gold, which of course did not exist. Anyway, it turns out that jewelers dislike farming, so much so that Captain John Smith, who soon took over control of the island, once said that they would rather starve than farm. So in the first year, half of the colonists died. 400 replacements came, but by 1610, after a gruesome winter called the Starving Time, the number of colonists had dwindled to 65. And eventually word got out that the New World's one-year survival rate was like 20%, and it became harder to find new colonists. But in 1618, the Virginia Company hit upon a recruiting strategy called the headright system, which offered 50 acres of land for each person that a settler paid to bring over. And this enabled the creation of a number of large estates, which were mostly worked on and populated by indentured servants. Indentured servants weren't quite slaves, but they were kind of temporary slaves, like they could be bought and sold, and they had to do what their masters commanded. But after 7 to 10 years of that, if they weren't dead, they were paid their freedom dues, which they hoped would allow them to buy farms of their own. Sometimes that worked out, but often either the money wasn't enough to buy a farm or else they were too dead to collect it. Even more ominously, in 1619, just 12 years after the founding of Jamestown, the first shipment of African slaves arrived in Virginia. So the colony probably would have continued to struggle along if they hadn't found something that people really loved. Tobacco. Tobacco had been grown in Mexico since at least 1000 BCE, but the Europeans had never seen it, and it proved to be kind of a thank you for the smallpox, here's some lung cancer gift from the natives. Interestingly, King James hated smoking. He called it a custom loathsome to the eye and hateful to the nose, but he loved him some tax revenue, and nothing sells like drugs. By 1624, Virginia was producing more than 200,000 pounds of tobacco per year. By the 1680s, more than 30 million pounds per year. Tobacco was so profitable that colonists created huge plantations with very little in the way of towns or infrastructure to hold the social order together, a strategy that always works out brilliantly. The industry also structured Virginian society. First off, most of the people who came in the 17th century, 3/4 of them, were servants. So Virginia became a microcosm of England, a small class of wealthy landowners sitting atop a mass of servants.
That sounds kind of dirty, but it was mostly just sad.
The society was also overwhelmingly male. Because male servants were more useful in the tobacco fields, they were the greatest proportion of immigrants. In fact, they outnumbered women 5 to 1. The women who did come over were mostly indentured servants, and if they were to marry, which they often did because they were in great demand, they had to wait until their term of service was up. This meant delayed marriage, which meant fewer children, which further reduced the number of females. Life was pretty tough for these women, but on the upside, Virginia was kind of a swamp of pestilence, so their husbands often died. And that created a small class of widows or even unmarried women who, because of their special status, could make contracts and own property, so that was good, sort of. Okay, a quick word about Maryland. Maryland was the second Chesapeake colony, founded in 1632, and by now there was no messing around with joint stock companies. Maryland was a proprietorship, a massive land grant to a single individual named Cecilius Calvert. Calvert wanted to turn Maryland into like a medieval feudal kingdom to benefit himself and his family, and he was no fan of the representational institutions that were developing in Virginia. Also, Calvert was Catholic, and Catholics were welcome in Maryland, which wasn't always the case elsewhere. Speaking of which, let's talk about Massachusetts. So Jamestown might have been the first English colony, but Massachusetts Bay is probably better known. This is largely because the colonists who came there were so recognizable for their beliefs, and also for their hats. That's right, I'm talking about the Pilgrims and the Puritans. And no, I will not be talking about Thanksgiving. Is a lie. I can't help myself, but only to clear up the difference between Pilgrims and Puritans, and also to talk about Squanto. God, I love me some Squanto. Let's go to the thought bubble. Most of the English men and women who settled in New England were uber-Protestant Puritans who believed the Protestant Church of England was still too Catholic-y with its kneeling and incense and extravagantly hatted archbishops. The particular Puritans, who by the way did not call themselves that, other people did, who settled in New England were called Congregationalists because they thought congregations should determine leadership and worship structures, not bishops. The Pilgrims were even more extreme. They wanted to separate more or less completely from the Church of England, so first they fled to the Netherlands, but the Dutch were apparently too corrupt for them, so they rounded up investors and financed a new colony in 1620. They were supposed to land in Virginia, but in what perhaps should have been taken as an omen, they were blown wildly off course and ended up in what's now Massachusetts, founding a colony called Plymouth. While still on board their ship, the Mayflower, 41 of the 150 or so colonists wrote and signed an agreement called the Mayflower Compact, in which they all bound themselves to follow, quote, just and equal laws that their chosen representatives would write up. Since this was the first written framework for government in the US, it's kind of a big deal. But anyway, the Pilgrims had the excellent fortune of landing in Massachusetts with 6 weeks before winter, and they had the good sense not to bring very much food with them or any farm animals. Half of them died before winter was out. The only reason they didn't all die was that local Indians, led by Squanto, gave them food and saved them. A year later, grateful that they had survived mainly due to the help of an alliance with the local chief Massasoit and because the Indians had taught them how to plant corn and where to catch fish, the Pilgrims held a big feast, the first Thanksgiving. Thanks, Thought Bubble. And by the way, that feast was on the 4th Thursday in November, not mid-October, as is celebrated in some of these green areas we call not America. Anyway, Squanto was a pretty amazing character, and not only because he helped save the Pilgrims. He found that almost all of his tribe, the Patuxet, had been wiped out by disease and eventually settled with the Pilgrims on the site of his former village and then died of disease because it is always ruining everything. So the Pilgrims struggled on until 1691 when their colony was subsumed by the larger and much more successful Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was chartered in 1629 by London merchants who, like the founders of the Virginia Company, hoped to make money. But unlike Virginia, the board of directors relocated from England to America, which meant that in Massachusetts they had a greater degree of autonomy and self-government than they did in Virginia. Social unity was also much more important in Massachusetts than it was in Virginia. The Puritans' religious mission meant that the common good was, at least at first, put above the needs or the rights of the individual. Those different ideas in the North and South about the role of government would continue until now. Oh god, it's time for the mystery document? The rules are simple. I read the mystery document, which I have not seen before. If I get it right, then I do not get shocked with this shock pen. If I get it wrong, I do. All right. We must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities? I don't know. For the supply of others' necessities, we must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. All right, first thing I noticed, the author of this document is a terrible speller, or possibly wrote this before English was standardized. Also, pretty religious individual. And the community in question seems to embrace something near socialism, abridging the superfluous for others' necessities. Also, it says that the community should be like a city upon a hill, like a model for everybody. And because of that metaphor, I know exactly where it comes from, the sermon, A Model of Christian Charity by John Winthrop. Yes! Yes! No punishment! This is one of the most important sermons in American history. It shows us just how religious the Puritans were, but it also shows us that their religious mission wasn't really one of individualism, but of collective effort. In other words, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one. But this city on a hill metaphor is the basis for one kind of American exceptionalism, the idea that we are so special and so godly that we will be a model to other nations. At least as long, according to Winthrop, as we act together. Lest you think Winthrop's words were forgotten, they did become the centerpiece of Ronald Reagan's 1989 farewell address. Okay, so New England towns were governed democratically, but that doesn't mean that the Puritans were big on equality or that everybody was able to participate in government, because no. The only people who could vote or hold office were church members, and to be a full church member, you had to be a, quote, visible saint. So really, power stayed in the hands of the church elite. The same went for equality. While it was better than in the Chesapeake colonies or England, as equality went, pretty unequal. As John Winthrop declared, some must be rich and some poor, some high and eminent in power and dignity, others mean and in subjection. Or as historian Eric Foner put it, inequality was considered an expression of God's will, and while some liberties applied to all inhabitants, there were separate lists of rights for freemen, women, children, and servants. There was also slavery in Massachusetts. The first slaves were recorded in the colony in 1640. However, Puritans really did foster equality in one sense. They wanted everyone to be able to read the Bible. In fact, parents could be punished by the town councils for not properly instructing their children and making them literate. But when Roger Williams called for citizens to be able to practice any religion they chose, he was banished from the colony. So was Anne Hutchinson, who argued that church membership should be based on inner grace and not on outward manifestations like church attendance.
independence. Williams went on to found Rhode Island, so that worked out fine for him. But Hutchinson, who was doubly threatening to Massachusetts because she was a woman preaching unorthodox ideas, was too radical and was further banished to Westchester, New York, where she and her family were killed by Indians. Finally, someone who doesn't die of disease or starvation. So Americans like to think of their country as being founded by pioneers of religious freedom who were seeking liberty from the oppressive English. But we've already seen that's only partly true. For one thing, Puritan ideas of equality and representation weren't particularly equitable or representational. In truth, America was also founded by indigenous people and by Spanish settlers, and the earliest English colonies weren't about religion, they were about money. We'll see this tension between American mythology and American history again next week, and also every week. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Miller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and myself, and our graphics team is Thought Bubble. If you have questions about today's video, or really anything about American history, ask them in comments. The entire Crash Course team and many history professionals are there to help you. Thanks for watching Crash Course. Please make sure you're subscribed, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about one of the worst relationships in American history. No, Thought Bubble, not my college girlfriend and me. Mr. Green, your relationship with your high school girlfriend?
Oh, me from the past. You and I both know that I didn't have a high school girlfriend. No, I'm talking about the relationship between Native Americans and English settlers. So as you'll no doubt remember from last week, the first English settlers came to the Chesapeake area, now Virginia, in 1607. The land the English found was of course already inhabited by Indian tribes unified under the leadership of Chief Wahunsonica, and I will remind you that mispronouncing things is my thing! The English called this chief Powhatan, because of course mispronouncing things was also their thing. Powhatan was actually his title and the name of his tribe, but to say that the English lacked cultural sensitivity would be an understatement. So Powhatan didn't get to be the leader of over 30 tribes by being a dummy, and he quickly realized that 1, the English were pretty clueless when it came to not dying of starvation, and 2, they were useful because they had guns. So he decided to help them, and the English were indeed grateful. In fact, colony leader John Smith went so far as to order the colonists to stop stealing food from the Indians. Oh, in the book business, this is known as foreshadowing. So as previously noted, relationships, whether between individuals or collectives, tend to go well when they are mutually beneficial, and for a while, both the English and the Indians were better off for these interactions. I mean, you know, post-smallpox. The Virginia Company existed to make money, and since the Chesapeake lacked gold or silver, making money required trade. Okay, let's go to the thought bubble. We tend to think of trade between Europeans and natives as being a one-way exchange, like savvy, exploitative Europeans tricking primitive, pure indigenous people into unfair deals, but that isn't quite accurate. Both sides traded goods that they had in surplus for those they did not. The English were happy to give up iron utensils, tools, guns, woven cloth, in exchange for furs and, especially in the early days, food, which the Indians could easily part with because they had plenty. Soon, though, there were problems. In order to keep up trade relations, Indian men devoted more time to hunting and less to agriculture, which upset traditional gender balance in their society, and European ideas about land use started to overcome traditional Indian ways of life, and that led to conflict. The English liked to fence in some of their land, which kept the Indians off it, and also the English let their pigs and cattle roam freely, and the animals would eat natives' crops. And as Europeans' appetite for furs grew, Indian tribes began to fight with each other over access to the best hunting grounds, leading to intertribal warfare, which suddenly included guns. But this was still a relatively calm time. Yes, at one point John Smith was captured by the Indians and had to be saved by Powhatan's daughter Pocahontas, but this was probably all a ritual planned by Powhatan to demonstrate his dominance over the English. Pocahontas never married John Smith, by the way, but she was kidnapped by the English and held for ransom in 1613, and she did eventually marry another Englishman, John Rolfe. She converted to Christianity and went to England, where she became a sensation and died of disease. Stupid disease, always deciding the course of human history. Anyway, despite not marrying Pocahontas, John Smith is still important to this story because when he left Virginia for England after being injured in a gunpowder explosion,
things between the Native Americans and the English immediately began to deteriorate. How? Well, the English went back to stealing Indians' crops and also began stealing their lives via massacres. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Man, you guys sure know how to end on a downer, although to be fair, there are not a lot of uppers in this story. So after a period of peace following Pocahontas' marriage to John Rolfe in 1614, dramatized here, things finally came to a head in 1622 when Chief Opechancanough led a rebellion against the English. It had become abundantly clear that more and more English were going to show up, and they weren't just there to trade, they wanted to take Indian land. But the English struck back, as empires will, and the uprising of 1622 ultimately failed. And after another failed uprising in 1644, the 2,000 remaining Native Americans were forced to sign a treaty that consigned them to reservations in the West, well, the west of Virginia at least. But the 1622 uprising was the final nail in the coffin of the Virginia Company, which was a failure in every way. It never turned a profit, and despite sponsoring 6,000 colonists, by 1644, when Virginia became a royal colony, only 1,200 of those people were still alive, proving once again that governments are better at governing than corporations. Up in New England, you'll recall that the Pilgrims probably wouldn't have survived their first winter without help from the Native Americans, which of course led to the first Thanksgiving and then centuries of mutually beneficial trade and generosity. Just kidding. While some of the Puritans who settled in New England, notably Roger Williams, tried to treat the Indians fairly, in general it was very similar to what we saw in the Chesapeake. Settlers thought Native Americans could be replaced because they weren't properly using the land. Now, John Winthrop, who you'll remember from last week, at least realized that it was better to buy land from Indians than just take it. But Puritan land purchases usually came with strings attached, the main string being that the Native Americans had to submit to English authority. Now, the Puritans had a rather conflicted view of the Indians. On the one hand, they saw natives as heathens in need of salvation, as evidenced by the Massachusetts seal, which features an Indian saying, "Come over and help us." On the other hand, they recognized that the Native American way of life, with its relative abundance and equality, especially when it came to women, might be tempting to some people who might want to go native. This was such a concern that in 1642, the Massachusetts General Court prescribed a sentence of 3 years hard labor for anyone who left the colony and went to live with the indigenous people. There was even anti-India propaganda in the form of books, captivity narratives in which Europeans recounted their desire to return to Christian society after living with the Indians, were quite popular, even though some, like the famous Sovereignty and Goodness of God by Mary Rowlandson, did admit that the Indians often treated their European captives quite well. New England's native population lacked an overarching leader like Powhatan, but by 1637, the inevitable conflict between the English and the Indians did happen. It was called the Pequot War. After some Pequots killed an English fur trader, soldiers from Massachusetts, the newly formed colony of Connecticut, and some Narragansett Indians who saw an opportunity to gain an upper hand over the Pequots attacked a Pequot village at Mystic, burning it and massacring over 500 people. The war continued for a few months after this, but to call it a war is in a way to give it too much credit. The Indians were overmatched from the beginning, and by the end, almost all of them had been massacred or sold into slavery in the Caribbean. The war opened up the Connecticut River to further settlement. It also showed that Native Americans were going to have a tough time resisting because they were outnumbered and they had inferior weapons. But the brutality of the massacre in Mystic shocked even some Puritans, like William Bradford, who wrote, "It was a fearful sight to see them frying in the fire." But despite the odds, New England natives continued to resist the English. In 1675, Native Americans launched their biggest attack on New England colonists in what would come to be known as King Philip's War. It was led by a Wampanoag chief named Metacom, which is why it is also sometimes called Metacom's War. The English called Metacom King Philip due to their fantastic cultural sensitivity. The conflict was marked by brutality on both sides, and it nearly ended English settlements in the Northeast. The fighting itself lasted 2 years. Indians attacked half of the 90 towns the English had founded, and 12 of those towns were destroyed. About 1,000 of the 52,000 Europeans and 3,000 of the 20,000 Indians involved died in the war. As I mentioned before, the war was particularly brutal. The Battle of the Great Swamp was really just a massacre of Indians by the English, and when King Philip was finally killed, ending the war, his decapitated head was placed on a stake in the Plymouth town square, where it remained for decades. And on the other side, well, to quote Nathaniel Saltonstall, who lived through the war, "The heathen rarely gave quarter to those that they take, but if they were women, they first forced them to satisfy their filthy lusts and then murdered them." Saltonstall went on to describe a particularly brutal way that natives would kill colonists' cows, by cutting their bellies and letting them go several days, trailing their guts after them. That indigenous people would reserve such brutality for livestock says something really important about this war. The Indians
Indians correctly saw European colonization as a threat to their way of life. And that included the animals who trampled Indians' land and whose grazing patterns required the English to take more and more territory. Some of the stories told about Native American brutality also suggest the symbolic nature of this war, like one English colonist was disemboweled and had a Bible stuck in his body cavity. Supposedly, the natives who buried him explained, "You English, since you came into this country, have grown exceedingly above the ground. Let us see how well you grow when planted into the ground." But it wasn't just the Indians who felt their way of life being threatened. It's time for this week's mystery document. The rules here are simple. I read the mystery document, I try to guess its author. If I'm right, I don't get shocked with the shock pen. If I'm wrong, I do. The righteous God hath heightened our calamity and given commission to the barbarous heathen to rise up against us and to become a smart rod and a severe scourge to us in burning and depopulating several hopeful plantations, murdering many of our people of all sorts, and seeming as it were to cast us off. Hereby speaking aloud to us to search and try out our ways and turn again unto the Lord our God, from whom we have departed with a great backsliding. Okay, I don't know this one, so I'm gonna have to piece it together. We have a plural narrator, that's important. Seemingly monotheistic, feels like the heathens, in this context likely the Native Americans, have been sent as a scourge, or scourge as it is apparently properly pronounced. What? I'm from Alabama. I don't know how to say a ton of words. I mean, I just recently learned that you don't check your Yahoo mail, you check your Yahoo mail. And Yahoo's over already. Right, so plural narrator, scourge, great backsliding. Stan, you're gonna get to shock me this time. Who is it? The laws of war passed by the General Court of Massachusetts in 1675? Are you kidding? From now on, the mystery document must always be written by a single human person. I hate this. I hate this so much. It's worse now because I've had it before, so now it's gonna... This shows us the way the Puritans understand the world, but it also shows us that within 50 years of its founding, Puritans already felt that the mission of their colony, to be a great Christian community, was already kind of a failure. If they'd been as righteous as they were supposed to be, God wouldn't have sent the Indians to burn their homes and kill them. So it's important to understand that this was a war to preserve a way of life for both the Indians and the English. And that brings us to another question. What's the point of even telling these bloody stories about massacres and atrocities? One point is to remind ourselves that much of what we learn about American history, like all history, has been cleaned up to conform to our mythological view of ourselves. Native Americans have been so successfully marginalized, both geographically and metaphorically, that it's easy to either forget about them or else to view them merely as people to be pitied or reviled. But it's important to know the ways that they resisted colonization, because it reminds us that Native Americans were people who acted in history, not just people who were acted upon by it. And it also reminds us that the history of indigenous people on this landmass isn't separate from American history. It's an essential part of it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The associate producer is Danica Johnson, and the show is written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and myself. Our graphics team is Thought Bubble. If you have questions about today's video, please ask them in comments. They will be answered by our team of crack historians. By the way, our team of crack historians is a team of excellent historians, not a team of historians who study crack cocaine. Thanks for watching. As we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today's video is kind of a response to one of the most riveting history books you'll ever read, The Columbian Exchange by David Crosby. He had a good year in 1969, published The Columbian Exchange, played Woodstock, he was still on his first liver. What is Albert Crosby? Gosh, history never being as interesting as I want it to be. Right, so it was Alfred Crosby Jr., and in that book he wrote, "The big questions are really the only ones worth considering, and colossal nerve has always been a prerequisite for such consideration." I love it! Before 1492, we couldn't really talk about a world history at all. We could only talk about the different histories of separate regions, but Columbus changed all of that and everything else. The Columbian Exchange irrevocably homogenized the world's biological landscape. Since Columbus, the number of plant and animal species has continually diminished, and the variation in species from place to place has diminished dramatically. I mean, the first European visitors to the Americas had never seen a tomato or a catfish. Native Americans had never seen a horse. And by making our planet biologically singular, the Columbian Exchange completely remade the populations of animals, particularly humans. And vitally, this cross-pollination also made possible such wonders as contemporary pizza. So we're going to break Columbian Exchange down into 4 categories. Diseases. Boy, you're looking good, Smallpox. I'm glad you've been eliminated. Animals, plants, and people. Mr. Green, people are animals. Yeah, that's true of me from the past, but just for the sake of simplicity. Also, if you think about it, microbes are kind of animals, and plants are too. I mean, oh my God, shut up before I kill you and create a time travel paradox. Microbes, like those hairy blokes back there, were a definite negative in terms of the Columbian Exchange. Terminology is hard here, but the majority of Caribbean islanders or Native Americans or Amerindians had exactly one response to the arrival of Europeans: death. We can't be sure how many natives died as a result of European arrival, but it was definitely more than 50%, and some estimates place it as high as 90%. Historians used to blame European brutality, which was definitely a factor, but the main culprit was disease. Smallpox is usually seen as the villain of this story, but it's more likely that a series of diseases in combination did the damage. Along with smallpox, Americans were killed by measles and mumps, typhus, chickenpox, none of which they had been previously exposed to. This astonishing decrease of population was definitely the worst effect of these diseases, both psychologically and demographically, but the secondary effects were almost as bad. For one thing, the deaths of Aztec and Incan rulers touched off wars, which in turn made it easier to spread disease because, you know, the #1 way to catch smallpox is via hand-to-hand combat. Plus, leaders kept dying. Huayna Capac, the leader of the Inca Empire, succumbed to smallpox before Pizarro even arrived. His death led to a violent succession struggle between his sons, which was won by Atahualpa, who in turn was captured and killed by Pizarro. And without that war, the Inca would have had a much better chance against the Spaniards, whose numbers were comparatively tiny. A similar thing happened to the Aztecs. The Moctezuma who eventually lost to Cortez was the nephew of a much more powerful king who died of smallpox. And the death of that great king encouraged some of the smaller states in the Aztec Empire to rebel, and some of them even fought for the Spaniards. And another side effect of disease was starvation, because there simply weren't enough people left to grow crops to feed the living. And then malnutrition made survivors that much more susceptible to disease. In short, it sucked. The transmission of disease largely went one way, from the old world to the new, but the Americans did have one gift for Europe: venereal syphilis. It showed up in Europe around 1493, and even though Europeans are very fond of ascribing syphilis to each other, Italians called it the French disease, the French called it the disease of Naples, Poles called it the German disease, Russians called it the Polish disease. The truth is, venereal syphilis was spread by sailors who'd returned from the Americas. In fact, in his book, The Columbian Exchange, Crosby tells it like this: "Sailors, by the nature of their profession, are men without women, and therefore men of many women. We can imagine no group more perfectly suited for guaranteeing that venereal syphilis would have worldwide distribution." Who says history books are boring? Syphilis would go on to infect a veritable who's who of Europe, from Baudelaire to Gauguin to Nietzsche, not to mention numerous family members of the famously infertile Tudor and Valois families, meaning that syphilis may be responsible for many of those miserably boring dynastic power struggles of post-Columbus Europe. Anyway, nothing against syphilis, but it pales in comparison to the devastation wrought by old world diseases arriving in the New World. But the New World did have one gift for the old world that was pretty destructive: tobacco. Oh, it's time for the open letter, and there's been a costume change? That doesn't bode well. An open letter to tobacco. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment. Don't be cinnamon, don't be cinnamon, don't be... Dang it! I guess that I'm going to do the cinnamon challenge. I am not happy about this, Stan. For the record. All right. I'm going to do the cinnamon challenge. 1 tablespoon of cinnamon in my mouth, no water. Oh boy, that sucked. I regret doing that, to be honest with you. Dear Tobacco, I just did something really stupid, but at least it was cheap. I'm gonna tell you 2 stories about smoking. The first comes from my high school history teacher, Raul Meyer, who also writes Crash Course. When I was a senior in high school, he walked up to me and he said, "I want you to keep smoking. I want you to smoke until the day after your 65th birthday, and then I want you to die so that I collect all of your Social Security." That inspired me, Mr. Meyer, to quit smoking just 8 short years later. Here is an amazing statistic. Cigarettes were handed out to American servicemen during World War II, and more soldiers who started smoking during the war died from smoking than died from the war. So if the New World was looking to extract some measure of revenge for smallpox and measles and chickenpox, mission accomplished. Best wishes, John Green. Now on to animals. American animals like llamas and guinea pigs never really caught on in Eurasia. But imports to the Americas like pigs, cows, and horses were revolutionary. Let's go to the thought bubble. First of all, these animals, especially pigs, completely remade the food supply. Pigs breed really quickly, they eat anything, and they turn into bacon, which made them heroes to the New World, just as today they are heroes to the internet. Here's how quickly pigs breed. When Hernando de Soto arrived in Florida in 1539, he brought 13 pigs. By the time of his death, there were 700. That was 3 years later. The abundance of meat and plentiful land for agriculture and grazing meant that Europeans in the Americas very rarely experienced famine, and despite what you may have learned about religious and political freedom, the main reason Europeans came to America was to eat. Large European animals also changed the nature of work in the Americas. Before Europeans, the largest beast of burden was the llama, and at best it could carry like 100 pounds. This meant that for the long distance travel that the Inca engaged in, the primary transportation animal was Incas. Oxen, when combined with their plows, made it possible to bring more land under cultivation and also made transportation easier and more efficient. And plus, European animals remade culture. The grossly stereotypical American Indian, like from the movies, riding the Great Plains with an eagle feather headdress and war paint, well, he didn't exist before the Columbian Exchange because there were no horses for him to ride. And the introduction of horses allowed many Native Americans to abandon agriculture in favor of a nomadic lifestyle because riding around hunting buffalo made them far richer than farming ever had. Thanks, Thought Bubble. While animals and diseases completely reshaped the New World, it was New World plants that had the biggest effect on Eurasia. Sure, Europeans brought over some crops that we now grow here in the Americas, like wheat and grapes, both of which are necessary for Catholic Mass. But New World plants radically changed the lives of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of Africans, Asians, and Europeans, specifically by making pizza possible. I mean, until 500 years ago, Italians lived without tomatoes, without modern pizza or marinara sauce or pizza or ketchup or pizza or even pizza. Indians lived without curry, which contains chilies, a New World food. Persians lived without corn, which is a New World food, as are beans and potatoes and avocados and peanuts and blueberries. The list goes on and on. And these New World crops led to probably the greatest population increase in history. To quote Crosby, "It is crudely true that if man's caloric intake is sufficient, he will somehow stagger to maturity, and he will reproduce." And New World food was far more caloric than Old World food, which is the central reason that the world population doubled between 1650 and 1850. Plants like corn and potatoes could grow in soils that were useless for Old World crops. Potatoes were actually introduced to Europe as an aphrodisiac, but it turns out that you have to distill those potatoes into vodka before they have the desired effect. Anyway, if potatoes are an aphrodisiac, the Irish quickly became the hottest people on earth. An acre and a half of potato cultivation could feed an Irish family for a year, and the average Irish worker often ate 10 pounds of potatoes every day. Surviving primarily on potatoes, the Irish more than doubled their population between 1754 and 1845 when the potato famine showed up and ruined everything. And it wasn't just Europe. Manioc or cassava is a New World plant with roots that provide more calories than any other plant on Earth, provided they are properly processed, otherwise they're poisonous. Manioc is so prevalent in Africa that many Africans swear the plant is native to the continent, but it isn't. Nor are sweet potatoes, and while New World grains never replaced rice in Southeast or East Asia, the sweet potato is so common that it is known as the poor person's staple in China. Even in Japan, the tomb of the farmer who is reputed to have first brought them to the islands is known as the Temple of the Sweet Potato. And it's also worth noting that corn, while it may not feature prominently in European diets, has been the central source of food for animals in Europe for centuries. And in fact, that's still the case. In 2005, 58% of the corn grown in America went to animal feed, is the kind of thing you learn when you live in Indiana. All right, so last but not least, the Columbian Exchange involved the transfer of lots of people. Again, in the early stages, this movement was mostly one way, with Europeans and Africans, the Africans usually against their will, making their way to the Americas. So the Columbian Exchange led to the repopulation of the New World following the disease devastation of the initial encounter, and better nutrition allowed the population of the Old World to grow, which in turn placed population pressure on Eurasia, which led to more people coming to the Americas. In the process, the world's human inhabitants became more genetically and ethnically interconnected, but it also led to the horrors of Atlantic slavery, which we'll be discussing next week. What are we to make of the Columbian Exchange? It devastated the population of the Americas, it led to the widespread slavery slavery of Africans, but it also allowed for a worldwide population increase, and the lives of some natives, including plains tribes like the Lakota, became better and more secure, at least for a while. Fewer people have starved since the Columbian Exchange began, but the diversity of life on Earth has diminished dramatically, and planting crops where they don't belong has hurt the environment. So on the whole, should we be grateful for the Columbian Exchange? And should we work to continue and deepen its legacy of globalism and monoculture? Crosby didn't think we were better off. The Columbian Exchange has included man, and he has changed the old and new world, sometimes inadvertently, sometimes intentionally, often brutally. It is possible that he and the plants and animals he brings with him have caused the extinction of more species of life forms in the last 400 years than the usual processes of evolution might kill off in a million. The Columbian Exchange has left us with not a richer, but a more impoverished genetic pool, and we, all of life on the planet, are the less for Columbus, and the impoverishment will increase. But let's give you the last word today. Do you agree with Crosby? Are longer, healthier lives for more humans worth the sacrifice of an impoverished biosphere? And most importantly, how will your conclusions about those questions shape the way that you live your life? Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Miller. Our script supervisor is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and myself, and our graphics team is Thought Bubble. Last week's phrase of the week was Mario and Luigi. Thanks for that suggestion. If you want to suggest future phrases of the week, you can do so in comments, where you can also guess at this week's phrase of the week and ask questions about today's video that will be answered by our team of historians. Thanks for watching Crash Course, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome.
Often when we think about the beginning of American history, we think 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, or maybe 1492 when Columbus arrived in the Americas. But the history of America really begins about 15,000 years ago, when people first arrived in the Americas. In this video, I want to provide a very brief overview of Native societies before contact, to give you an idea of just how diverse and complex these societies were as Native groups adapted to and interacted with their environments. Now, there's recently been a scholarly debate about how people first arrived. We know that maybe 12,000 years ago, during an ice age, the sea level was lower, and so a spit of land in between the Americas and Asia was exposed, over which people may have traveled. But recent archaeological evidence suggests that people were perhaps already in the Americas at the time of this ice age, so it's possible that they may have come earlier in boats. Now, however it was that they arrived, they spread north and south and east throughout the Americas, so that by the time that Europeans arrived in the late 1400s, there were perhaps 50 million people. That's kind of a mid-range number for the estimates that historians have made living in the Americas. And of those, 4 to 6 million were living in North America. So how did these societies develop? Well, a really big moment was around 5000 BCE, when people in Mexico domesticated corn, maize as it's also known. And domesticating maize meant that people who had originally been hunters, gatherers, following herds of animals, could partake in settled agriculture. So they could develop villages, complex societies. This isn't to say that they stopped hunting or gathering, but they began staying in one place. So let's zoom in a little bit and take a look at some of the major societies in these regions. Native American societies developed around their natural environments using the resources that were available to them. For example, the Southwest Plains and Great Basin are quite dry. A lot of desert. And so societies in these regions adapted to the dry climate in several ways. For example, Native American groups that lived on the Great Plains continued their hunting and gathering way of life, hunting bison and following the herds of animals in teepees, which were dwellings that were easy to set up and then take down. People in the Southwest, like the ancestral Puebloan people, dealt with this dry environment by creating very complex irrigation projects so that they could water their maize crops using what little moisture there was. The Puebloans lived in large cave complexes as agriculture allowed them to grow their population. In the Northwest, fishing in the Pacific Ocean gave Native Americans a plentiful source of food, while farming allowed the Mississippian peoples to develop large settlements like Cahokia near modern-day St. Louis, which at its peak may have had as many as 25 to 40,000 residents. The Mississippians and other East Coast Native peoples relied a lot on what's known as three-sister farming, in which people would plant corn, beans, and squash together, which was mutually beneficial to all three plants, as the corn served as a trellis for the beans, and the squash protected the root system of the corn. All three together create a very nutritious diet, which allowed for relatively high population density on the East Coast. So by the time that Europeans began to arrive in the late 1400s and 1500s, Native societies had been evolving for over 14,000 years. But the introduction of European people, pathogens, plants, and animals would introduce an unprecedented amount of change in the Americas. When we think about European exploration in the Americas, we tend to start at 1492 with Christopher Columbus showing up at the island of Hispaniola. But in this video, I want to take a step back a few decades and talk about the conditions that led to Christopher Columbus's voyage in the first place. What was he doing there? So let's zoom in a little bit and take a look at what the world would have looked like to someone in Western Europe around the year 1450. So to a European, this would have been about the extent of the known world. Now, they wouldn't have had anything like the level of this detail, but they certainly knew that there were very good things to be had in India and China and the Middle East. Excellent trade goods like silk and spices. And they knew there was quite a lot of world outside of Europe and Africa. But they didn't think that there was much out there. They expected there would be some small islands on the range of Iceland, perhaps, but they had no conception that there were two gigantic continents on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. It's a frequent misconception that people in this time period thought that the world was flat. Learned people of the era knew that the world was round. In fact, they had known so since the time of the Greeks. What they did know was that the world was pretty large. In fact, they correctly estimated that the circumference of the globe is about 25,000 miles. And so they knew that given the shipping technology that they had, it would be impossible to go west and arrive at the east while still having enough food and water to supply your crew. Now, why would anyone have dreamt of going west to get east when they could have simply gone east to get east? Well, the answer is that the overland route was long and it was expensive because the Middle East and North Africa and even parts of Spain were controlled by Muslim empires like the Ottomans and the Moors. And so anytime trade came from the East, from China, India, the Middle East itself, it went through a series of traders and a series of empires along the way, picking up taxes and markups, which meant that by the time a good reached Western Europe, it was pricey indeed. And since Muslim traders were in control of the Mediterranean, here and at the east, taking a ship through there caused pretty much the same problem. So why not go around the coast of Africa? Well, that was certainly something that Europeans were keen to do. The only problem is that the wind goes in the wrong direction. It's very treacherous sailing around the tip of Africa to come up into the Indian Ocean. So what changed? How did this overland trade route become an oversea trade route? Well, for that, we have to look a little bit closer at the Iberian Peninsula. So this landmass here is the Iberian Peninsula. And at the time, the Iberian Peninsula was controlled by a number of different groups. The southern part was under Muslim control of the Moors, as they were called, or Moroccan Muslims. And they called this area Al-Andalus. We're talking about this area here. And the Spanish called it Granada. The western part here was under the control of Portugal, as it is today. Portugal. The eastern part, this area here, is the Kingdom of Aragon. And then the central part here was Kingdom of Castile. So as far as Europeans were concerned, this was kind of the end of the world. This was as far southwest as you could go on the European continent, and heaven knows what was out here. Until in the early 1400s, Portugal's Prince Henry the Navigator began investing in navigation. And one of the important discoveries made by the Portuguese was a new kind of ship, and this ship was called the caravel. So what's cool about the caravel is that caravels are ocean-worthy, but they're also very easy to maneuver, and they can sail into the wind. So that means that the problems of sailing around Africa begin to get a little bit easier. And so in this early era of the 1400s, the Portuguese began expanding their exploration farther and farther down the coast of Africa. And they come across these islands now that they don't have to hug the coast, the Canary Islands. And farther west, this is so small you can barely see it here, Madeira and the Azores. And they quickly discover that these islands are ideal places to grow cash crops, specifically sugar. They also discover that some of the people who live on these islands, in fact, the Canary Islands had a native population called the Guanche. They immediately attempted to enslave these native people and then quickly discovered that they would die of disease. And we'll talk more about why native people seemed to be so susceptible to European diseases a little bit later. So now they have great places to grow sugar, but they don't have a workforce. Well, they're discovering another workforce along the coast of Africa as they begin to set up, this is the Portuguese we're talking about here, trading posts on the west coast of Africa, where they're purchasing slaves from African traders or Arab traders who had a long history of trading slaves from the interior of Africa out to its coast. So in the early 1400s, Portugal is doing very well for itself. Seems that they're leading this colonial game. They've pretty much invented the plantation system, and they're getting quite wealthy off of it. So the eyes of Europe turn to Portugal, and they think, all right, how can we replicate their success? Meanwhile, back on the Iberian Peninsula, there's a political and religious shakeup. So the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon are united when Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, and I recognize that my Spanish pronunciation is terrible, they get married in 1469 and unite their two kingdoms into what becomes the Kingdom of Spain. So what had been Castile and Aragon becomes Spain. And then united, these two Catholic monarchs turn their attentions to what's called the Reconquista. So reconquering the territories that had been controlled by Muslims for Christians. So I would call this kind of an extension of Crusader thinking. And Ferdinand and Isabella complete the Reconquista, expelling the Moors from the territory that is today Spain in 1492. So now we've reached 1492, and we've got a will, that is, a desire for luxury goods. We also have a little bit of good old-fashioned nationalism here. Spain's closest neighbor is Portugal, who are currently very powerful and wealthy. So they've got perhaps some rivalry in their hearts. And we've got a way, which is the caravel that is making more and more ocean sailing possible. And into this exciting moment steps Christopher Columbus, and we'll talk more about him in the next video. In the last video, we discussed how the Portuguese began to really expand their exploration around Africa with the invention of the caravel, a fast new ship that could sail into the wind, and how Spain, newly united with Ferdinand and Isabella, completed its campaign to expel Muslims from Spain, the Reconquista, in 1492, and began to look outward for an opportunity to compete with Portugal. And it was into that moment that they received an interesting proposal from this man here, Christopher Columbus. So who was Christopher Columbus? Well, he was a navigator. He was born around 1451, we think, in Genoa, which is today in Italy. And he had sailed quite a bit in his life. He was also a voracious reader, thanks to the invention of the printing press back in 1450. And one book that he read with great interest was the account of Marco Polo and his travels in China. And Columbus dreamt of getting to China and there accessing riches, silk, and spices, and maybe even converting people living in Asia to Christianity and teaming up with them in a new crusade to expel Muslims from the Middle East. Now, there are two common myths about Columbus that I'd like to dispel. One of these is that Columbus was the first European to discover the Americas. In fact, we know that around 1000 CE, the Vikings of Norway had colonized Greenland and had explored around what is today Canada. So you might be asking, okay, well, if the Vikings discovered America, why aren't we talking about the Vikings in this video? And the short answer is the Viking settlement in the Americas did not last very long, less than a generation, and it also didn't really get well known outside of Norway, so it didn't have the worldwide impact on colonization that Columbus's voyage would have. The other myth about Columbus is that he was the lone visionary who knew that the world was round. Everybody else thought that the world was flat, and Columbus proved them wrong. In fact, most learned people had known that the world was round since the time of the ancient Greeks. What they thought instead was that the world was simply too big. They estimated that it was about 25,000 miles in circumference, which is pretty close to the truth, and that even if you could sail out here into the ocean, you would run out of supplies and die long before you ever hit land, because they had no idea that the Americas were over here. Columbus, however, had done some different calculations, and he thought that the circumference of the world was only about 16 to 18,000 miles. So that the coast of Japan was about 3,000 miles to the west of Europe. Now, he was wrong, but he got very lucky because about 3,000 miles to the west of Europe, he encountered landfall. He just didn't know that what he found there wasn't China. So Columbus has this dream, and he kind of shops it around the courts of Europe looking for royal patronage. And first, he tries the Portuguese because they are the reigning leaders of navigation, and they turn him down, saying his idea is too risky. He also tries France and England with similar results. Finally, he tries Spain. And Ferdinand and Isabella agree that they will stake him. They give him 3 ships and a crew of 87 men. And in August of 1492, he takes off, makes a brief stop in the Canary Islands, and then turns west into open waters. And in October of 1492, he made landfall, and this is what he found. So he landed on the small island that he named San Salvador, which is today in the Bahamas. And then he continued to explore around the coast of Cuba that he called Juana. And then he ended up in the island that he called Hispaniola, which is today the island of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And we'll talk more about who he met in the New World in the next video. In the last video, we discussed Christopher Columbus's attempt to find the funding to find a western route around the world to China and the East. And how, although he didn't find that, in October of 1492, he landed in the Caribbean, where he met the indigenous people living there, the Taínos. So who were the Taínos? So we know a little bit about them. They were one of the indigenous peoples in the Caribbean. This is a woodcut that depicts people in the region made a little bit later, so they may have looked something like this. And they were adept at fishing. We know that they were probably matrilineal. That is, they traced their family lines through the women, not the men. We know that they were very generous people. Columbus repeatedly describes how people would really give you anything that you asked for. We also know religiously that they worshipped ancestor spirits called Zemis. And this is a statue of one of those ancestor spirits that we still have today. Another thing I think is really cool about the Taínos is that we still use some of their words in everyday language that were borrowed by the Spanish and then came into English. So barbecue, for example, they called barbacoa. Hurricanes, they called huracan. Tobacco was one of their words for the plant that will become so popular. Even the name of the island itself, they called it Haiti, which is still preserved today in the nation of Haiti. So Columbus sailed around the Caribbean, and then he made his way back to Europe. He left behind him 39 men whose ship had run aground, so they built a fort. And when he arrived in Europe, he immediately wrote a letter to the finance minister to Ferdinand and Isabella, Luis de Santangel. So let's look a little bit more closely at what he wrote. As I know you will be rejoiced at the glorious success that our Lord has given me in my voyage, I write this to tell you how in 33 days I sailed to the Indies, with the fleet that the illustrious king and queen our sovereigns gave me, where I discovered a great many islands, inhabited by numberless people, and of all I have taken possession for their highnesses by proclamation and display of the royal standard without opposition. To the first island I gave the name of San Salvador, in commemoration of His Divine Majesty. The second I named the island of Santa Maria de Concepcion, the third Fernandina, the fourth Isabella, the fifth Juana, and I found it so extensive that I thought it might be the mainland, the province of Cathay. This is really interesting because you can tell a lot about what Columbus is thinking here. First, he says that he's taken possession of these islands by proclamation and display of the royal standard without opposition. And I love this image of Columbus. He's reading in Spanish the proclamation, I claim this land in the name of Spain, and he's not opposed because the Taínos have no idea what he's saying. You can also see his religious motivations here as he names the first islands after San Salvador, the Savior, Jesus, Santa Maria de Concepcion, the Virgin Mary, and that he's trying to win some points with Ferdinand and Isabella by naming islands after them. You can also see here that Columbus thinks that he's found China. He says he thought it might be the mainland, the province of Cathay. Cathay is an old word meaning China. So let's read on. He says, I began fortifications there, which should be completed by this time, and I have left in it men enough to hold it with arms, artillery, and provisions for more than a year, and a boat with a master seaman skilled in the arts necessary to make others. I am so friendly with the king of that country that he was proud to call me his brother and hold me as such. Even should he change his mind and wish to quarrel, neither he nor his subjects know what arms are, nor wear clothes, as I have said. They're the most timid people in the world, so that only the men remaining there could destroy the whole region. So he's kind of saying that we're getting along with the natives, but if we don't, they're not a threat. And he finishes by saying, to speak in conclusion only of what has been done during this hurried voyage, their highnesses will see that I can give them as much gold as they desire, if they will give me a little assistance, spices, cotton, as much as their highnesses may command to be shipped, and as many slaves as they choose to send for all heathens. So Columbus is finishing by saying, well, this exploratory voyage has shown that we can get a lot out of colonizing this area. We can get gold, spices, cotton, slaves. And so if you will give me a little assistance, that is, give me more resources to continue my mission, Spain will get very wealthy indeed from this new land. And that is exactly what Ferdinand and Isabella do. So they send him on a second voyage in 1493. And this time they send him with 1,200 men and 17 ships. And they bring with them livestock, horses, cattle, pigs, and sugarcane plants, so they can turn this into a plantation. So they really intend to use this settlement as not only a place to try out growing crops and also mining for gold, they also see it as kind of a jumping off place that they can use for further exploration in this area. Because the Portuguese were so dominant in this early phase of colonialism, the Spanish are nervous that the Portuguese are going to try to make inroads into their new acquisitions in the West. So with the help of the Pope, they negotiate what's called the Treaty of Tordesillas, dividing the world between them. So east of this line here, this will be Portugal's area of the world, and west of this line will be Spain's. Remember that Portugal had lots of interests in Africa, which they thought were much more valuable at this time. But it was later discovered that part of South America fell on Portugal's side of the line, and you'll recognize that as being today Brazil, which became a Portuguese colony and even today speaks Portuguese. Now, of course, they didn't ask anybody else's permission to divide the world between them. They didn't ask the native people of the Americas. They didn't ask anybody else in Europe. But it's important to understand that Spain thought of this area as their sovereign territory. And from this point forward, Spain will continue to send what are called conquistadors, conquerors, to this region, Mexico, and Florida, and South America. And from all of this, they will become very wealthy as a nation. So I just want to finish by contrasting how Columbus's voyage affected the native people of the Caribbean with how it affected Europe. So Columbus was not very nice to the natives, in fact. He originally attempted to enslave the native people and send them back to Europe for sale to continue to underwrite his ventures. But they were susceptible to European diseases and quickly died. So he had to take another tack, and that was by forcing the native people to labor for the Spanish, particularly to mine gold. And not long after Columbus returned, he put a quota for all people over the age of 14 that they had to give him a certain amount of gold per month, or they would have their hands chopped off. And this is an engraving of what the Spanish were imagined to have been like in the New World. You can see that they're feeding children to dogs here. They were not quite as bad as this, but they were still pretty bad. Historians estimate that there were about 1 to 3 million Taínos living in the Caribbean when the Spanish arrived. By 100 years later, there were 200 left. Not 200,000, 200. And mostly this was due to disease, and we'll talk more in the next video about why native people seem to be so susceptible to European diseases. But it was also due to overwork and poor treatment. They were forced to mine when they should have been growing crops, and many of them were murdered by the Spanish for one reason or another. So for the people of the Caribbean, Columbus's arrival was really a catastrophe. In Europe, however, the New World made Spain very rich. And the gold and silver being brought in from the New World to Spain may actually have increased prices in the 100 years following Columbus's voyage by 500 to 600% due to inflation, thanks to gold from the New World. Some historians even think that the influx of all this new wealth led to the creation of the modern banking system to deal with it, and could even have been the forebear of capitalism. So Columbus's voyage really opened up a whole new world, not just to the people in the Americas, but also to the people in Europe. He started a process, the Columbian Exchange. We'll talk more about that in the next video. Although we tend to think about Christopher Columbus's first voyage in 1492 transforming the history of the Americas, it actually transformed a great deal more than that. And in this video, I want to talk about the larger world historical process that Columbus's voyage opened up that transformed not only the Americas, but also Europe and Africa. And this was called the Columbian Exchange. So what was the Columbian Exchange? This is a process of transferring plants, animals, microbes, and people across the Atlantic in both directions. And not just trading these goods, but transplanting them from Europe and Africa into the Americas and the other way around. And some of these exchanges of species were intentional, like bringing new crops to grow in environments that were suited to them. And some of them were unintentional, like the microbes and pests, which were like little hitchhikers on the bodies and crops that Europeans brought to the New World. And it had a tremendous environmental effect that had real consequences for people on both sides of the Atlantic. So let's look a little bit closer at some of the things that were exchanged across the Atlantic after Columbus began the process of bringing things from the Old World to the New World and from the New World to the Old World. So first, let's take a closer look at the plants. Now, Spain, much like Portugal, was hoping to use this tropical landscape to grow cash crops. And so Columbus brought with him sugar and grapes for wine and coffee. These were all crops that would fetch high prices in Europe. It was so lucrative to grow sugar in the Caribbean that they didn't even want to give up any space to grow food. They imported their food so that they could spend all of their land growing sugar. The Europeans also brought New World crops back to the Old World, and some of these, it's almost impossible to imagine a world before, for example, the tomato had ever come to Europe. Can you imagine Italian food with no tomato sauce? They also brought corn and potatoes and sweet potatoes and cassava or manioc. And what's important about most of these crops is that they're very calorically dense. So if you grew a field of potatoes instead of a field of wheat, which might be a typical crop grown in the Old World before contact, you can feed 3 times as many people with a field of potatoes than you can with wheat. So what does this cause? It causes a real increase in population in Europe. It also causes an increase in population in Africa, where manioc is a crop that was frequently grown and also very calorically dense. So New World foods helped Europe and Africa increase their populations. So what about these animals? The Europeans brought cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses to the New World with mixed results. Horses, for example, were a tremendous technology that was widely adopted throughout Mexico, and the Native Americans living in the Great Plains of what is today the United States found that horses revolutionized their ability to hunt. So that was a great step up for them. The pigs they brought over, however, weren't so great because Europeans allowed the pigs to roam freely, which meant that they ate everything, including the Native Americans' crops, and they multiplied very quickly. So they became kind of a pest in the New World. Probably the thing that had the biggest effect in the Columbian Exchange was the transfer of Old World diseases to the New World. So with Europeans came smallpox, measles, whooping cough, and the Native Americans had very little immunity to these diseases. It's estimated that within 100 years of Columbus landing in Hispaniola, 90% of all people who were living in the Americas died of disease. This is a demographic catastrophe, the likes of which the world has never seen before or since. And most of the Native Americans who were affected by these diseases would never have actually interacted with a European. They just had trade networks that spread these diseases back and forth throughout the Americas. Now, you might be wondering, okay, so if the Native Americans were being exposed to new diseases from the Europeans, weren't the Europeans also being exposed to new diseases from the Native Americans? Why didn't it have such a strong impact on them? There are a couple of reasons for that. One is that there was a greater population density in Europe and Africa. There were more people and they lived closer together in cities. And so this gave diseases opportunities to bounce back and forth between people and evolve and become stronger. The other important thing is that Europeans lived close to animals. And as we remember from things like bird flu or swine flu, animals and humans can pass diseases back and forth between each other, and that makes those diseases even stronger. In comparison, Native Americans didn't have much population density, and they only domesticated dogs. And dogs, unlike pigs can't pass that many diseases back and forth between humans. So Native Americans just didn't have diseases that were as vicious as the diseases that had been passed from person to person for many thousands of years in Europe and Africa. So this gets to the last aspect of the Columbian Exchange, the exchange of people. So very quickly after Europeans arrived, the Native American population suffered from a tremendous outbreak of disease, which meant that although the Europeans had hoped to enslave them and use them as a labor force in these Caribbean plantations, very few of them survived, which meant that the Europeans needed another labor force. They found that labor source on the west coast of Africa, where there was a long tradition of slave trading. And they brought enslaved African people against their will across the Atlantic to work in the Caribbean. So that very quickly a majority of the population in the Caribbean was of African descent. Ironically, this population explosion brought on by New World foods meant that there were more people in Africa who were possible subjects to enslavement, and it helped them keep their population numbers relatively steady despite the exodus of as many as 12 to 13 million people over the course of the years between Columbus arriving and approximately 1800. Likewise, this population explosion in Europe led to worries about overpopulation in the 1600s and 1700s. And what did the nations of Europe do? They began sending people over to the colonies. So the contact and exchange initiated by Christopher Columbus when he connected the old world with the new had a profound effect on the environment, not just of the new world, but of the old world as well. And this profound effect on the whole benefited Europe at the expense of the Americas and of Africa. Imagine that one day you were standing in your backyard when all of a sudden you saw an alien ship land. And the alien ship had incredible technology, and you saw aliens walking out of the ship bearing strange animals, maybe scary-looking weapons, and speaking a very strange language. What would you do? Would you try to be kind to the aliens, hope that maybe you could befriend them? Would you fear them and perhaps immediately try to make war against them? Would you hope that perhaps War of the Worlds style, that they would die of the common cold? Or would you fear that maybe they had some kind of common cold that you might die of? These are the choices that were faced by Native Americans when they encountered the Spanish at the end of the 1400s. Columbus arrived in the New World in 1492, and when he got back in 1493, the secret was out that there were great riches to be had in the New World. So much so that as early as 1494, Spain and Portugal were trying to decide how they would divide the riches of the Old World and the New between them. So in the years after Columbus's first voyage, many Spanish conquistadors, or conquerors, began exploring throughout the Americas. And it's not necessary for you to memorize any of these names, but I want you to get a sense that in the 50 years or so after Columbus, European explorers began checking out everything in the Caribbean, North America, and South America. And their motivations, like Columbus's, were the 3 Gs of colonization. Gold, that is, to get rich. Glory, that is, to bring glory to oneself or one's nation. And a little bit of God, that is, to bring Catholicism to native peoples living in the Americas. Now, as you can see from the many individuals here, Spanish colonization was a very complex process taking place in many different regions. But in this video, I want to focus in on just a few aspects. The conquest of Mexico by Cortez, a society that came out of this blend of Spanish and Native American culture, and a little bit about the resistance to colonization that we'll see in New Mexico with the Pueblo Revolt. Now, like Columbus, Spanish explorers originally were looking for a passage to Asia through the Americas, but quickly learned that there was quite a lot of riches to be found in the Americas themselves. And one place that came to the attention of the conquistadors was Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Aztec Empire. Now, the Aztecs were not well loved in Mexico. They ruled over a vast territory with many smaller tribes they required to give them tribute and even human captives for sacrifice. So in 1519, Hernán Cortés, a Spanish conquistador, landed with a group of about 600 men in Veracruz. And with the help of some translators, he worked his way across Mexico, learning of the general dislike of the Aztec Empire, so that when he finally came upon the city of Tenochtitlan, he had about 20,000 Native Americans who were ready to make war on this city along with him. Now, it's hard to imagine what Tenochtitlan would have looked like to the Spanish. It's estimated that it had about 200,000 to 300,000 inhabitants, which made it one of the larger cities in the world. There was nothing quite so large as this city in all of Europe. It sat in the middle of a lake with hanging gardens and an aqueduct, and had incredible pyramids that were many stories tall. And at first, Moctezuma II, who was emperor of the Aztec Empire, treated the approaching Spaniards with great kindness and generosity, showering them with gifts. After all, the Spanish had things that Moctezuma had never seen before, like horses and gigantic war dogs, which they used to rip apart their enemies, and cannons, which, even though they only had a few of them and they didn't work very well, were very frightening when they were fired, much like I think a ray gun would be frightening to us now. Now, it didn't take very long for the relationship between the Spanish and the Aztecs to crumble, and aided by their many Native American allies, and also by the spread of deadly disease like smallpox, which decimated the Native American population. By 1521, Tenochtitlan had fallen, in fact was in ruins. Montezuma had died, and the Spanish began building on the ruins of Tenochtitlan, Mexico City. But much to the horror of the many Native American tribes that had allied with the Spanish would turn out to be much crueler imperial masters than the Aztecs had been. And the smallpox that had ravaged the Aztecs ravaged the rest of the Native American population as well, as they lacked the immunity to European disease. Although much of the conquest of the Spanish Empire in the New World was done by conquistadors, adventurers, the Spanish crown was eager to place some control over this new territory. And one way that they did this was through the encomienda system. And the encomienda system was a labor system that, in a way, was kind of a combination of feudalism from Europe and slavery. So the idea was that the Spanish crown would grant landholders, called encomenderos, the right to the labor of Native Americans, perhaps a village or two, and anything that those Native Americans produced through their slave labor, so gold if they mined it, or agricultural products if they were working on a plantation. And in theory, what the Native Americans would get for this would be Christianization, which to the Catholic Spanish crown was an important goal to convert all of the world's people to Catholicism, and also the protection of these Spanish feudal lords or encomenderos. In practice, the encomienda system was really just another way of saying slavery. And between the harsh treatment of the Spanish lords and disease, the native population of this region went from about 20 million when the Spanish arrived to only about 2 million by 1600. So that not very long after conquest, the Spanish began to bring enslaved Africans to labor in the New World, as the Native American population had shrunk to a fraction of its former size. So for the native people of Mexico, the arrival of the Spanish was about the worst outcome of an alien invasion that you could imagine. Now, native people did resist the Spanish in many ways. Some ways were more subtle, like outwardly adopting Christianity while maintaining their ancestral beliefs inwardly. The combination of Native American beliefs and Christianity together is called syncretism, or the blending of two religious traditions. But sometimes the Spanish pushed native people too far, as in the case of the Pueblo Revolt in 1680, when, after a few generations of being forced to shed all of their religious beliefs in favor of Christianity or face severe punishment, the Pueblo people rose up against the Spanish, led by a man named Popé. So that sometimes the Pueblo Revolt is also called Popé's Rebellion. And they killed Spanish priests, burned churches, replaced them with kivas, their own place of worship, and drove the Spanish out, so that in the next 50 years it took the Spanish to reestablish control of this region. The Spanish took a much more accommodating approach to Pueblo society. The last aspect of Spanish colonial society that I want to point out is the racial caste system that developed in the New World. Because the conquistadors were on dangerous adventures, very few Spanish women came with them in the New World. And so Spanish men had relationships with both Native women and African women, and Native Americans and Africans had relationships, such that there was really an unprecedented mixing of peoples and cultures in the New World. And to account for this incredibly diverse society, the Spanish developed a caste system that very carefully ranked individuals by how much Spanish blood they had, so that people with pure Spanish blood, criollos, were at the top of the hierarchy, and people who had both Native American heritage and European heritage were called mestizo at the time, whereas people with European heritage and African heritage were called mulatto at the time. And so as you moved up or down this scale, you had more legal rights than the groups below you. And this is what is known as a casta painting, which very carefully categorized where every person fell on this hierarchy of race. So we see in the Spanish caste system the beginnings of assigning legal status to individuals based on their race. But I think it's also important to note here that the casta system made a place for many different types of people in society. And that will be important later when we contrast it with how English settlers treated Native Americans. The Spanish sought to Christianize and incorporate and enslave Native people, whereas the English sought to completely eradicate them from the landscape. In the first years of interaction between Native Americans and Europeans, there were a lot of aspects of each other's cultures that each group found, just plain weird. Europeans and Native Americans looked, dressed, and thought differently in fundamental ways that led to misunderstandings and even violence between them. So let's take some time to compare some ways in which Native American cultural ideas differed from European cultural ideas. So how is it possible to make a direct comparison between Native American cultures and European cultures? One way is to choose a few categories of social interaction and belief and identify how each group conceived of them. Here I've chosen ideas about land and property ownership, gender roles, and religion as areas to compare. Now, before we start, I want to put a big asterisk here and say that these are generalizations. Just as the English, French, Spanish, Dutch didn't have all exactly the same religion or concept of proper gender roles, the Algonquians, Iroquois, Pueblos, and Mississippians weren't identical either. But there were some similarities among European groups and among Native American groups that allow us to compare and contrast them more broadly. So let's start identifying these differences and exploring what effect they may have had on how the two groups perceived and interacted with each other. One major difference between Europeans and Native Americans was in their ideas about land ownership. To Europeans, land was owned by individuals and passed down through families. They had the right to fence off a plot of land and prevent trespassing. For Native Americans, land ownership was less defined and more temporary. One tribe might claim control of a hunting range, or one family might farm a plot of land for a season, but they didn't own it forever. Most land was free for everyone to use, but not to own. So when Europeans arrived, Native Americans might agree to let them farm and hunt in their territories, but they didn't expect that Europeans would then fence off that land and prevent others from using it. Likewise, Europeans were confused when Native Americans continued to use land that they thought they had purchased to own forever. Native Americans also tended to have a more communal approach to property and trade. To them, trading relationships were important, and they required a lot of feasting and gift-giving to cement ties between tribes. Europeans were frequently frustrated by the amount of pomp and circumstance Native Americans demanded to complete what they saw as a simple business transaction. Partly, this had to do with how Native Americans viewed property in general. While Europeans gained high status in society by owning a lot of things and therefore being rich, Native Americans achieved high status by giving a lot of things away, being a source of riches for others. So unlike in Europe, where there were huge gaps between the rich and the poor, Native American societies were comparatively egalitarian. It was pretty rare for someone to go hungry if their neighbor had food to spare. Europeans couldn't tell if Native Americans were just naturally generous, kind people, or if they maybe just didn't get how business worked. And to Native Americans, Europeans seemed greedy and selfish, allowing others to starve and do without so that they could enrich themselves. Differences in gender roles also confused the groups. In European societies, men were the heads of household and they were in charge of outdoor labor. Women took care of the home, but they also had relatively few rights. They couldn't participate politically, own property, or get divorced. In Native American societies, men hunted and fished and conducted warfare, which often meant that they were away from home for weeks or months. Consequently, women did the farming, since they were home to tend the crops. Native women also had a lot more freedom than European women. They could get divorced. They could give political advice to councils. Many Native American societies were matrilineal, so children belonged to their mother's family rather than their father's. And when a couple got married, the man moved in with his wife's family, not the other way around. To Europeans, gender roles in Native society almost seemed like they were flipped upside down, and they took this as evidence that Native people were uncivilized. To Native Americans, it looked like Europeans could barely care for themselves. They had to be taught how to farm, how to fish, even how to hunt effectively in the New World. Finally, Native and European religious practices differed, at least on the surface. Native Americans tended to believe that one great creator had made the world and that nature was imbued with spirits who would reward or punish them based on how well they took care of the land. In fact, this actually wasn't that much different from the Catholicism of Europeans, who believed in a single God, but also many helpful saints. But where they differed was in exclusivity. When Europeans introduced them to Jesus and Mary and the saints, many Native Americans were happy to include them in their pantheon of helpful spirits. But this angered Europeans, who insisted on exclusive worship of the Christian God. All of these differences led to fraught interactions between Europeans and Native Americans. But despite these differences, they also adopted many useful aspects of each other's culture over time, especially in terms of trade. Native Americans were keen to get their hands on the metal implements for cooking and farming and hunting that Europeans possessed, as well as guns and horses, which were great for transportation and also for making war. Europeans were also willing to take part in the social rituals and trading rituals of Native Americans, sometimes even marrying into Native American families, so they could get access to furs hunted by Native Americans and to Native Americans as allies in their wars against rival European powers in the Americas. So, as we wrap up, I encourage you to take a closer look at this chart. Is there anything you find particularly surprising about these differences? Where do you think that Europeans and Native Americans were most likely to find common ground between them? And lastly, which of these cultural aspects do you think was the most significant difference between Europeans and Native Americans, and why?